Hi, Alexandra. It's so good to see
Hey,
you.
Sheila.
Everybody, I'm Sheila Black. I'm the development director at AWP and a poetry teacher and poet. And I invited Alexandra Vandekamp here. She's the executive director of Gemini Inc. She's a poet and she's the author of two books now.
Two full lengths, yeah, and several chapbooks, sure.
Lots and lots of chapbooks.
Yeah, a lot.
And tell the names of your books, Alexandra.
My first book is called The Park of Upside Down Chairs, and my more recent one is called Kiss Hierarchy. It's based on an Anais Nin quote. And then I have several chapbooks.
And it's a beautiful book. Alexandra's a wonderful poet. And she's also somebody who's done a lot of teaching of poetry in general, all over the place, but also specifically online. Alexandra, tell me a little bit about how you started teaching online, because you've done it way more than I have.
Believe it or not, my first, because I taught rhetoric and writing at Stony Brook University for years, so obviously was doing academic teaching of writing, enjoying it. I was first approached by Lissa Kiernan, who ran something at that point called The Rooster Moans. Okay, it's a great title. And she had online workshops through that organization. So I actually taught my first poetry workshops, creative writing workshops, online. So I did the big, what do you call it, deep dive into creative writing teaching, both learning how to teach creative writing and then learning how to do it on an online platform. And this is a huge shout out for Lissa Kiernan. She runs the Poetry Barn, and a lot of my ideas I've learned from her, and she was a great coach during that time. This was probably 2013, something like that.
So you were
what's that?
You were a pioneer.
And they used a platform called Wet Ink. It's asynchronous, which some of you might know that term, some not. It's a kind of an internal term, but it's an online experience, unlike Zoom, which is that live session, and that's great. This is asynchronous, meaning you start a class. A lot of the classes were 1 month long. So I did a prose poem class for 1 month. That was my first one. And people can access it 24/7. Okay, so let's say the lesson goes live on April 5th. Lessons were posted once a week on a Monday or a Sunday. And you had a lesson, how long you wanted to make it was totally up to the teaching artist. There was discussion questions, and then there was a weekly prompt. And this was set up, this platform, specifically for creative writing classes. So you'd have a little space where you would post your poem whenever you were ready, and people would give you comments on that. So she was kind of teaching me how to navigate that, which was surprisingly user-friendly. And so I learned how to teach poetry workshops online.
Actually, that makes me feel better, Alexandra, because full disclosure, I'm teaching my very first poetry workshop right now online, having never done so. And Alexandra, who's someone I know, sent me her curriculum, and I was kind of blown away and pretty almost intimidated. So I wanted to, and because I realized that in all my years as a teacher, I had always done tons of research and reading poems I liked and making little scribbly notes, kind of like Emily Dickinson's poems on her little envelopes that may or And then I was talking to another friend of mine that was a teacher, and we both agreed that our strategy was basically do all this reading around the subject and then go in and sort of wing it. And one of the things that impressed me about the shift to online is you really do have to be in some ways more forward organized. You have to lay out your curriculum ahead of time. And I thought maybe you could give a few tips on how you've done that, because I think you do it really well. You set me a high bar to meet. And it was
no, and actually, we're super thrilled, Sheila, to have you teaching for Gemini. She's teaching a great poetry workshop for us on using maps and lists, and it's going really well. You do have to probably do more of that forward prep. That's a good expression, Sheila. The first time you might do an online workshop, let's say on an asynchronous platform, like any class you first time teach, it's a fair amount of work, but then it's set up. And what's great about these online classes is they're very reusable, right? So I've been, told I over explain things,
Oh,
but what I did was, I think a key thing, and anyone who's teaching online workshops for the first time who's a veteran has probably navigated this terrain and they're figuring it out each time they do a new class. But I found it was very helpful to very step by step unpack the class. So let's say with my prose poem workshop, the first week, that first lesson, the first half of it is setting the class up and giving people a clear map of what will happen, right? So I told people the theme of each of the 4 weeks. I told them that how long it would take me to respond to their work. Some people are super fast responders. I'm a little plodding. It takes me a little while. So I was just upfront about that. It will take me 6 days, at most a week, to respond to your work. And I also set up kind of expectations. Like, what works well in these online workshops is clearly you don't want to be the only person giving feedback, just like in a real class. So we suggest, and it's kind of, a requirement, that each participant responds to at least 3 other works posted each week by other participants. And then the instructor obviously responds to all. Some of the best conversations that happen, I found, in the poetry workshops I've taught, is in response to people's poems. You get one person posting a comment, then as someone else is posting, and that becomes a wonderful flow of a conversation. And there's something about seeing people's comments read. You learn a ton from them. I mean, all I know is I had incredibly talented poets taking my workshops. I almost felt guilty sometimes. I was learning so much from them. But there was something about reading the comments. They become texts in their own right. And you learn about how people give other people commentary. And there's a lot to be taken away from that, let alone like the lesson plans. So a relief for an online teacher is you don't have to do it all. You know what I mean? If you set your students up right and they get flowing in some of their feedback, they're already like showing good commentary on how to talk about imagery, or students come up with things, as we all know, in the regular classroom you would never think about. And that could be one of the really satisfying aspects of the class, that I would be blown away by some of the comments because I was learning from them. You know what I mean?
That it's very interesting how the document for the class becomes almost a teaching document, or a very rich document in its own right. One thing I was struck by that I thought you did very well and was really helpful to me is I was so used to relying on, I guess, the charisma of the classroom, the energy of the classroom, meeting people, reacting to their body language, knowing what they looked like, that I was a little freaked out. And one thing I thought you did very well was not only set the stage for students in terms of expectation, but you kind of laid out a welcome mat for them.
Mm-hmm.
Also laid out a lot about how their writing process might look. And I thought that was very helpful. I mean, you would sort of give an exercise and you would say, spend some time, thinking about these words, or looking at, you were doing one class of one of the curriculums you shared with me was for an ekphrastic class. And you gave very precise instructions about various ways they might engage with the art, almost like you were giving them a lot about process in your instructions. And I found that very interesting because you do that in a classroom, of course, but you do it very, you don't really register that you're doing it. It's in all this direct conversation.
Sure.
So it's super interesting for me as a teacher, as creative writing teacher, to see those sort of thoughts about process really unpacked and explained. I thought that was actually something very valuable in a way, because it's.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I guess, as you always do as a teacher, you really want to create a safe environment for your writing students so they feel like they can experiment. And without that face-to-face contact, or cues, as you say, it's a good point, Sheila. I found my prompts were a bit longer because some of that process writing was in there. It was like, one of them was, we did like an object prose poem. lessons. So of course we're talking about Robert Bly, Francis Ponge, all these great prose poets who would look at an object and do amazing things with it. And the way they talked about it was so unusual. And that space of the prose poem allowed them to do maybe things that were a little bit different from a lyric poem. And lyric poems are fantastic, of course. But so what I would do is, like, in one of my prompts, I gave a few paintings as samples, like a Matisse painting, for example, of one of his amazing guitars. They didn't have to use that, but people have called prose poems still lifes. So I said, you can use one of these, find one online. If you do find one online, give us a link to it. But the poem should be written so someone doesn't have to look at the piece of art to understand it. So I gave them kind of instructions in the prompt about how they could go about interacting with a piece of artwork. And you're right, that would probably be something that you would like maybe be talking about more ad lib in the classroom. It's found its way in the prompt.
Exactly.
And then
and I have to say I love that, because those prompts which said, they were almost fascinating, because they'd say, spend 10 minutes looking at it, go do something else. It was as if you were giving people permission to luxuriate in their process.
Oh, that's a nice, I like that idea.
Which was, to me, very interesting, because I think that's often, a struggle in writing. How do you get people to kind of give themselves the permission? And it's sort of an advantage of the kind of engagement people have with these classes that can go on 24/7, is that they can it is sort of a space, a virtual space that's always with them, that they can kind of enter and have permission to really spend time on their art or their creative process. But I felt the cues you gave were probably very important for people to.
Yeah,
really.
They were like, I would give people options about how to do a prompt. I'd be a little more step by step, but yeah, there was probably more process language in my prompts. Of course, you're always saying use concrete language, use sense details, but, I would give them maybe 3 different pivots or ways to look at a prompt. I'm kind of a prompt nerd, so I kind of lean in that direction anyways. And you're right. I want to give them a sense of the process. What's that, Sheila? Sorry.
More about being a prompt nerd. That's a great
term. I also noticed, like, that welcome mat aspect you talked about. I did, take time in that first lesson to be like, this is what's going to happen every week. You know what I mean? And one thing I did was remind them that there's discussion questions at the end of a lesson. So I tried to give them opportunities to either discuss things or post questions, and I would try to post. I was re-looking over one of my lessons, like the prose poem class you mentioned, and I could tell I'm kind of going out of my way to be like, here's another discussion question. Feel free to weigh in. I was trying to give as many ways for my students to enter into the conversation of that lesson, because I'm sure what a lot of teachers worry about is, oh my God, is it going to be crickets? Like, it's going to be me, doing the lesson, and can I get them talking like I would in a real class? And, each class is going to be different. Some will be like, chattering away right away. Others might take a little bit longer to digest the first lesson and begin talking. But that was something I was very aware of. Like, on the, for example, Wet Ink, which is asynchronous, there's a discussion page, as you know, Sheila, because you're using it for our Gemini Ink class. Yes. And it's a great way to get threads going. But then your lessons, you as a teacher have to decide, okay, am I going to put in a discussion question? So I would do that. And I would, similar things, like the first lesson, I'd say something like, what made you want to take a prose poetry workshop? How did you get here? Give us your background. And people would just get going. It was more than just like, this is my name. Hi, It helped. But I would do discussion questions with the lesson. And then I would post some more on the discussion page. I could just tell I was very aware of trying to give people different opportunities to weigh into the conversation.
I mean, and it's great, because you have your students who step right in and your students who hang back. But it is the challenge that you feel as if, and that's why I really love the welcome mat aspect. You do feel, and I think this is an important tip for people switching over, that you have to be a little more formal and intentional about how you're creating that community, because you don't have that automatic sense of everyone's in a classroom, we're all here together. I've been so heartened, though, that once you do that, it's been almost amazing to me how quickly comments have started to multiply and relationships form. I mean, that's a very sort of hopeful thing about online teaching that was a surprise to me, was that I went in as almost a Luddite, not you'd always managed to resist entering the virtual space, like, oh, the virtual space for pedagogy. I think I thought it was some secret code that oh my God, I'll never be able to figure it out. And I found that I think my anxiety about it was, so much for me was always about that sort of circle of the classroom, that relationship, and would it be able to be created online? And, interestingly enough, I think, and I took a lot of tips from you, I really noticed all those prompts and welcome mats and asking questions. But I found there's sort of a silence in the beginning, and then it begins to mount. And then you're kind of amazed. It's almost like this rich novel is unfolding in front of you of different people, forming sort of friendships or relationships based on their work. And that's been very interesting to me.
No, I think I'll just jump in. I think you're right, Sheila. I've noticed, like, what happens with like a month-long writing workshop is it's more of a accrual, right? Like, we're used to that, the one-off of you go into the classroom with a cup of coffee, you're there for an hour, you're good to go, or 2 hours or 3, and then you're done for the week. The interesting aspects of these online platforms, and there's many out there, they're blooming as we speak, is it allows the momentum of the class to accrue week by week. And it becomes and so it might be a little slower in the beginning, or it might not. There's a little patience involved with, sometimes people have to read those lessons and absorb them before they can give a comment. So there's more that, because you don't see the student's face when they're reading the lesson, you don't know what's going on, right? I've noticed that's a perfectly normal thing to expect. But what's amazing is it begins to build momentum, and then it really accrues, and you have a very rich collection of ideas. And what Wet Ink does, and I think other platforms do it too, is they actually send you a zip file at the end of the class of all the discussions, all the comments. It's like this gem of a thing that lands in your inbox. So you can actually have this wonderful snapshot of the class that you can keep with you. And what I like about these online workshops, like, for example, the one you're teaching for us this month, Sheila, there's actually an archived 2 weeks after the class officially, quote unquote, ends, where students can still access the online lessons. Maybe they got behind on the 3rd week or the 4th week. They can still write those prompts. The teacher might not be there to give comments anymore. Some teachers decide to, but it's totally not required. But they have access to the materials. And then it gets packaged up to them and emailed to them. And it's a wonderful thing to take away from a workshop.
Yes.
So I think those are the wonderful, it's almost like having a little textbook coming out of the class that you can kind of pluck under your arm and keep with you. So I found that quite rich. I've seen, and the relationship part is amazing. Like, some of my workshops that I taught at the Poetry Barn, you make friends with these people, with your participants, like you would in a real class. And a lot of us became like Facebook friends. And then one of the beauties of it was the Washington, D.C. AWP. Lissa Kieran had a reunion reading for all Poetry Barn teachers. And I met in person some of these students.
Oh, that must
be class. And I met even one of them again at the AWP in San Antonio this year. They're like, hey, Alexandra, remember me? It's just a wonderful, so these relationships bloom, and they wouldn't have been ones you would have made maybe easily otherwise, because they're maybe from, New Mexico or California. They're not someone who would be taking an in-person class with you.
Another super interesting thing about the online experience. I mean, you get students. I have one student who's living in Bogota, Colombia.
Sure.
A student, students from Texas, students from New York, students from Washington, D.C., and there is a kind of exchange that becomes possible of perspective. I mean, it happens in a normal university situation regardless, people often come from all over, but it seems even intensified in the online space. I'm just going to ask a really, base question for the kind of
Sure.
teachers out there. What are a few, I think you've given a lot of ideas and tips. Do you have any real tips for somebody who is like me a month ago coming in going, or, just wanting to know how they can enhance their online teaching or class? Just a few.
Sure. I mean, one thing is, and I do not feel like I'm the only expert in online classes at all. Like, people are doing amazing things. The whole explosion of Zoom or things like that is a wonderful live option that actually you could easily like put a link to a Zoom session into this asynchronous platform and then chat with your students too. So there's all kinds of options. But if you're a first time teacher coming to an online class, one, I found it wasn't dry. I thought it would be dry, and it wasn't. The classes are quite attractive. You can post pictures, links. They're broken up. It's like any good website. They're attractive and spacious looking. So that was a huge relief. I wasn't stuck in this like dry space, So that you probably don't have to worry about as much as you have to. You're going to probably have to prep like you have to do for any class, but especially for a first online one. Write out your first 2 lectures at least before it begins. Let's say you're posting a lecture a week, and really get your thinking down. And then think about at what points in this lesson would I want conversation to happen, and think about fun ways to do that. Okay, it can be as simple as a discussion question. I did notice that even though in some ways you're more formally preparing the class, a conversational tone in the class really helps, right? So you want to have, you want to kind of maintain that conversational rapport with your students, just like you would in a live class. So in addition to the lesson, there's things you can do, like you can post spontaneous posts, like a lot, like, oh, I was just thinking about this video. It was connected to a comment, Shanna just said, and you post the video and be like, hey, look at this if you have time. It's 2 minutes. What do you think? So there's ways to create a conversational atmosphere that is not as hard as you think. And then once you, and then writing out prompts with a little bit more foresight that have a more step-by-step quality, or maybe offer 2 or 3 ways of attacking the subject matter, I do find is rich. And it gives students more flexibility in how they write out of a prompt. I'm sure I'm not the first one to say that, but it did seem to help for the online platform. If you're a good teacher writing in person, you're going to be a good teacher teaching online. You know what I mean? If you're a good, writer teaching in person, it'll translate to online. You know what I mean? I mean, if you're a seasoned teacher, you know what you have to do, and you'll find ways to have it work in that platform. It's changed a lot. I think the online possibilities are maybe much more than they were 10 years ago. So that also helps. And then your students are so used to doing Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that they're good at like creating threads of their own.
Oh, they are. They're very good. One thing that was a big relief to me, and this is going to sound so corny, but I think you'll understand, was I had somehow always been, a very, like, I gave lectures in a sort of eccentric way. I was a fairly eccentric teacher, and it worked, and I told a lot of jokes, and I was a little anxious, like exactly what you said, like, will I have to be so formal all of a sudden that I don't have my personality in? And then when I saw the various sample curricula you gave me, I realized, oh no, I have, what makes you a good teacher often is going with your strengths, being yourself, as well as being open to a lot of influences. But you always have to bring your personality somewhat into the classroom. And that holds true for online as well, which was sort of a relief to me to realize the degree to which, oh yes, your personality in the classroom does kind of translate into that virtual space.
Yeah, it does. I think it will show in how you just naturally write your lessons, respond to people's questions. People totally pick up on your personality, and the atmosphere that you would typically create in a face-to-face class will find its way organically into an online. So, I think that's a fear that it might not it might happen in new and different ways. Like it might be more like how you respond in writing to someone's poem or how you write a prompt, but it'll show, our personalities show whether we want them to or not. I think that's kind of an unstoppable process.
But I have enjoyed, there is something safe. I think once you establish that welcome mat and that feeling of safety, I'm still in my first week, but I've been really heartened by the degree of intimacy that's created. And in some ways, I've gotten some really wonderful poems already. And I've been kind of thinking, wow, people took a lot of risks and felt a lot of confidence. And I'm doing this class, as you know, on mapping and mapping your life, sort of mapping patterns and making lists. I was very inspired by Kate Greenstreet, because she's such an amazing poet in terms of her process and how she kind of creates all this compost for her poems by saving little, she has this huge book and she pastes in things from her day and she writes journals, and she's always making use of this kind of raw material in her artistic process. And I think part of that, this is a big digression, is because she came from the visual arts in some ways. She was a visual artist as well. So she was really used to thinking of working with material, but I thought that would be interesting. And that was part of my mapping idea. But in some ways I was asking students pretty quickly to be personal and be sort of open with the group they didn't know, and it's online. And people really have embraced that process. And I feel that in some ways the virtual space does have I used that word earlier, but does have this luxurious feel for the writer engaging with it.
Because you can dip in as much as you want as a student. So unlike a one-off class once a week, face-to-face, and of course you can always email your teacher and things like that. And I know a lot of university classes have a Blackboard element where conversations can be happening. So, the differences between a live class and an online class are blurring a little bit, but there's still differences, right? I've noticed that you can create a really nice sense of intimacy because you're together for a month and it's a little bit more, if it's a month-long class, or even if it's a 2-week class. Like we're developing right now Gem and Ink, which I'm kind of excited about, like a 2-week online writing retreat. And it's going to be
an
idea. Tina Berry, it'll kick off in mid-May. But the idea is to give students some prompts, share craft points, and then you share this writing space for 2 weeks, and you're helping people just generate good work and be in a supportive community, and of course get good feedback. But that is luxurious, you know what I mean? Because it's 2 weeks of ongoing kind of interactions with the teacher, with the other students. A lot comes out of that. And then an intimacy also comes out of it. I think people just feel each other's tone and how they're responding to each other's work. A lot of times all students go, hey, messenger me on Facebook. Let's continue this outside the class, because they're just making a friend, and it just kind of bleeds beyond the parameters of the class. And I do find, like with the Zoom workshops happening now, I'm sure, my husband's kind of funny. He works at University of Texas, San Antonio. He was like, I think I've met every pet of every one of my staff members, right? So this whole space of home and work or creation are blurring. And there's an intimacy that comes with that. Like people are able to share about themselves in new and different ways, because we're here in this shelter-in-place reality, and our virtual space is starting to kind of be like that extra room in your apartment or house that you are now opening up the door and using, and it's a part of your home life, much more so than it was before. There's stresses with that, but there's also some richnesses coming out of that. And I think one thing I found, I'm kind of going off totally, Sheila, but one thing I found out is we are totally missing each other. Like we need that connection. So, and the live video obviously become very important recently. A lot of people are just teaching via the Zoom. That's going to be different from an asynchronous workshop, but they both have their richnesses, right? So, obviously an online Zoom workshop might be shorter. Maybe you're teaching 1 or 2 hours a week, And it's going to be more like a live interaction, except you have to think about how to maneuver and make sure you're seeing everyone. I did have a meeting with 12 people last week via Zoom, and you know how the pictures slide across the top? I found myself scrolling back and forth and making sure I had all the names and I was speaking to everyone. So it's a little bit of a new normal for how to make sure everyone in the classroom or meeting is speaking, right? Or you've at least introduced everyone, but we'll learn it. You know what I mean? You do 1 or 2 times and you're like, okay, that's how that goes.
Well,
So,
that really was actually exactly the next question I was going to ask. And I think you've kind of answered it of, this is obviously a scary and hard moment, and we've sort of embraced virtual space in a new way. And so you were just sort of talking about some of the discoveries of that. I love that idea of the extra room in your house. I think one thing we're learning is actually how to create formal and less formal spaces in the video world with each other when we can.
Sure.
And so when you had a writing retreat, I was thinking, oh, that's kind of interesting, because you might have like a Zoom meeting with one of the students there, like you have a manuscript consultation as a teacher, but then you might have a group discussion. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities for how that virtual space feels for people.
No, continue, Sheila. I don't mean to.
Well, that's as much as as far as I've gotten.
I mean, I think we're totally in the throes of discovering it week by week now. I mean, one thing that's good coming out of it is I think there's new versions of intimacy happening. And then there's also challenges, like how do you stay in touch with your staff, let's say, on a weekly basis, because you can't walk down the hallway and have a cup of coffee with them. So I see people coming up with all creative ideas, like an hour coffee chat in the morning, you know what I mean? And you could do this, of course, with your students in a workshop. People are doing like virtual office hours, people are coming up with everything. But a wonderful thing I've seen happening is literary collaborations are very easy now. Like I was approached by Blake Kimsey, who runs Writing Workshops Dallas, also a great place for online workshops. And we're doing this thing called the Big Texas Read. I'll just talk about it for a second. And it's a virtual book club. And we're going to feature David Levinson, who's a wonderful novelist who's taught both for Gemini Inc. and for WWD. And we're going to have author chats every 2 weeks because his book's 400 pages long. And we're going to kind of accompany the reader for every 100 pages. And it's fun. And you kind of have company during the ride of the novel, the journey of the novel. And then at the last Zoom session, we're going to let people read it over 2 months because we know how busy people are. He's going to give away a free author consultation for one of his books, just like pick out of the hat from one of the students that RSVP'd.
Yeah.
So that would have never happened if it wasn't for this horrible, devastating COVID-19. It's a little silver lining. I think Blake and David thought they could approach me because it was all virtual. And we're going to be highlighting a different Texas author every 1 or 2 months. We don't have to pay jet fuel. We don't have to pay a hotel. As much as I want to support that, this is one thing that's kind of nice. It's much easier to have different writers from different locales take part in your programming.
Well,
so
I think we never really saw the possibilities of that, either as teachers or students.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were beginning to sometimes have somebody Skype in and stuff, but I don't think we were as comfortable with it or as familiar with it, knew how to make it work. And I feel that, even when you talk about an asynchronous platform and then integrating Zoom into it, that's a fairly new, it's not new, but really using it fluidly feels new to me. And I've been struck, and it also really seeing some of that, and this has come out of need, but some of that video interchange as a genuinely social thing. I mean, people are having virtual happy hours. I know, right. And virtual cocktail parties. I had a little virtual reunion with my students in my MFA program that was years and years ago. And it was lovely. And we were all pretending to be at the bar where we used to meet.
Oh, that's great. I love that idea.
But it was a little bit virtual fantasy space. So maybe when you do a reading retreat, we could have, some Zen green plants, a video monitor where they just see some beautiful plants in the view. that they can go in and talk. I don't know. But what I mean is I think we're imaginatively embracing this in a lot of ways. And I think that all those things are pretty exciting.
Despite the challenges, I mean, but yeah,
Okay.
go on, Sheila. Did you want to say anything else? Because it's an interesting thread that you're talking about.
No,
I mean, I know someone was telling me about like Zoom backdrops. So that's like a whole artistic thing where you can, of course you see like my bookshelves here behind me, but you can protect your private space, right? So you can actually choose to put a different backdrop. Someone had like a Hollywood looking swimming pool behind them. So that's kind of a creative thing. And I do feel like that is, I think your point's a good one, Sheila, that we're kind of losing any hesitations we would have about inviting people into our space. Like, having another writer come in and be a part of a Zoom session is so easy now. And that is happening a lot more. Even though we were using it before, I think now it's almost becoming more of a norm. So different kinds of conversations are much easier to have happen now. You know what I mean? Where you can get like an author from New York, like Patricia Spears Jones, wonderful poet. We would have her come, for like our summer writers conference in person. Well, now I can think about reaching out to her and being like, hey, you want to join us for this author chat in a month? And it's not so hard to set up. So I love that these new kinds of conversations with writers from different areas is people are doing it more effortlessly and without thinking about it too much anymore. And that is something that is fun.
I think,
despite, us,
I think,
yeah.
I do think there are some challenges though, which I think are interesting to consider. One is that the challenge of, the challenge, I thought of two things. One is, as those lines between home and work blur, I think one question on a lot of teachers' minds is, and I know you're pretty experienced with this, but this sort of time management.
Sure.
The classes are so interesting and exciting. And that's, by the way, a problem teachers have anyway. Most teachers become so passionate about their classes that if they have to spend 24/7 grading, they often just fall into it. But I've known from being a teacher like that there's always a point when you have to be like, enough. You have to somehow claim space that is yours. Just you can't work all the time. But it kind of and when you love what you do, is most, I love teaching a creative writing workshop. I know it, and I know that most of our fellow teachers out in the world out there do too. But I do wonder about the time management of teaching virtually, when you could go in at any time or your students can go in at any time. Did you find you set yourself some sort of limits on that?
That's an excellent question. You can get burned out because, of course, there's like, okay, the students, you can have a student from New Zealand taking your workshop, posting something at 3:00 in the morning, right? I've heard teachers, and I was okay at this, but not great. But I do use it, and I've heard it can really help. If you're doing like a month-long or even 2-week-long asynchronous workshop, teachers set themselves time frames. They'll say every day from 2 to 5 or 2 to 4, I'll work on the class. And when that time's up, they're done. And so they pace out, or they say Saturday, it depends on how you work. Saturday is comment day, and I'll do most of the comments then. I'm free Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, and then I'll start again. So it's an excellent question to ask. I think because you have that blurring of home life and professional life, you have to take care of yourself. And especially if it's asynchronous, I found that's one tactic teachers use. And that's, once again, what's great about the online platform is you just tell your students that. You say, this is how I respond to work. I'll be doing it several hours a day. I expect it to be meted out. Don't expect to hear from me these 1 or 2 days unless I tell you otherwise. And they'll totally respect that and understand that. So I found that can help people. That's one strategy, at least.
Because I think we're all struggling. I know that teachers are, and certainly nonprofits like Gemini Inc. or AWP, with the tremendous potential of the virtual space to be collaborative, to be this, to be that, and the difficulty of how are you monetizing that for writers? How are you monetizing advertising that for participants so that people are able to, you know, writers and teaching artists especially who've been affected by what's going by the unprecedented, very difficult, and kind of a time of change we're in. I mean, when we were talking about the retreat in the virtual space, it was sort of a promising side of, you know, things have been, but at the same time, we're in a very sort of fearful moment when we don't know what's coming. And I think one of the big challenges is thinking about the virtual space as an opportunity for everyone. And because I think it is to build different kinds of connections, to unmake some hierarchies that have kept out, or not every writer or student able to participate to the same degree. That seems very promising. At the same time, it feels as if we do have to think about, you know, how are the teaching artists, how are the writers, how are the teachers going to be fairly, you know, paid for their work if it's so easy in the virtual space? Do you know what I mean?
I feel a great question, something we're extremely concerned about at Gemini Inc., paying our teaching artists. Because, of course, like many organizations, we had these great in-person classes and they got canceled this spring. What's fun is we're doing different types of workshops, and you can kind of roll them out a little bit faster with different pricings.
Right.
So we want to make them accessible. So, like, you know, you can sell a Zoom workshop. Maybe you have a teacher teach 1 hour a week for 3 weeks, and it's quite reasonable, like maybe $50, $75. Whereas maybe our traditional 4-week class, 2 hours a night, would have been more expensive. So we're coming up with different types of classes. Some are more informal, and we're giving our teaching artists, you know, we're giving them honoraria to teach these based on the pricing and everything, or based on hourly wages, you know, like a teaching fee for an hour. So I'm actually trying to roll out workshops as fast as we can do it with quality still intact, to give teaching artists who are idle opportunities. Okay. A lot of that's happening with our youth workshops. We seek, if you don't mind me talking about this for 1 second, but it's a great example. So we reach at-risk communities in San Antonio, which has a 25% illiteracy rate. So that outreach with creative writing is hugely important. We have online versions of that. Yeah. So our director, Philander Brown, and I are working together, and she's got great teaching artists. And there's an equity issue here. Not everyone has a computer in their household. Not everyone even has a cell phone. What the heck do you do? So they thought first to roll out some free classes, because we have some of our funders who are funding those in-person classes willing to pivot it to online support. So we're trying to come up with some free options, like for a 3rd or 5th grader. We're putting it on our YouTube channel. It's free, and that is easy to download, let's say on a cell phone, which more households will have a cell phone maybe before they have a laptop computer. That's one thing we've tried to figure out. We also are doing paid classes, but really inexpensive, so they don't overwhelm parents. You know what I mean? And then like maybe $20 for a kid's class, you know, for maybe a 5th grader or a middle schooler. And maybe it's an hour Zoom class, but then you can take it again the next week with a slightly different angle. I mean, we're literally doing this as we speak. So yeah, you have to find a way, like, how to make it accessible for everyone. I think what's good about it is we're doing grant-backed workshops, but then we're doing these paid workshops for youth. We didn't do that before, at least for Gemini Inc., and it's actually offering more opportunities for our teaching artists, because they're doing 2 different kinds of workshops with us. And of course, we just leave them to it. They're great. They come up with great ideas. So, but I also have heard people say they're getting zoomed out.
Yeah.
You do find that your brain's a little fried at the end of the day if you've done those Zoom sessions. So I think we're going to start coming up with things that aren't video. I don't know. It's too soon to say, but you feel that we're going to want to reach out in different ways. Like, I don't know, maybe you do the 6-foot social distancing, like poetry hour or something, where you're on the street. We have, like, you know, block parties where everyone's 6 feet apart and there's 10 people and they're talking poetry. I don't know if that's going to work, but there are limits to how long you can be on a Zoom session, how much you can be in front of a video camera. I don't know if we've found the solution yet, but I think that's something that, people are going to start coming up with other ways of
Well,
interacting somehow. So we have
the asynchronous platform like Wet Ink does not put you on a video screen directly. And one of the things that was interesting about your prompts, to go back to the teaching, was how often I thought the prompts you shared in your ekphrastic and your prose poem class were about sending people into the world. Now, right now, set in the world kind of means nature, your backyard, walking 6 feet away from people. I never thought, Alexandra, the day would come. I went for a walk yesterday and I saw a group of people walking far away, just a couple. I looked at them like with longing, like and you're walking out here, and how wonderful to see you. There is that really interesting human connection, but I think that it's interesting that one thing to go back to thinking about how you're teaching online is, I think people of my generation, I mean, I'm 59. I'm like, oh God, I'm getting old. But I do remember that, so, and often it was very boring, but we were sent outside from morning till night as kids. We were pushed out the door. This was 70s parenting. My mom would die if she saw this. She'd say no, but there was really a feeling like once your kids were 5 or 6, they were out the door and they were gone all day. We're biking, tree climbing, and you did get formed a lot by that sort of slow, weird, patient, sometimes boring observation of being out in the world. So I think that one thing I noticed in your poetry prompts I thought was interesting was how often that process description was actually sending people out into the world. You would say, go look at this, go do that, lie down and think about this. I mean, it was quite interesting. I feel
like tell people to walk. I mean, one of them is, I know, just to chime off of that, Sheila, like we talked a lot about Rimbaud, obviously in the first prose poem class, because he's one of the first prose poem writers, and he was a great crowd watcher. And a lot of his poetry would come from just people watching. So one of the prompts was to do some people watching and talk about the circus of life in a Rimbaud kind of a way and put it into a prose poem with concrete details, sensual, using sight, sound, hearing, and then leaps in imagination, because I think some of the best prose poem writers make interesting leaps in their imagery and thought. So even though you're using the sentence instead of the lyrical line, there's spaciousness in that sentence that allows you to do things with logic that maybe you wouldn't think of in a lyrical line. So now, how would I do that? Basically, I think there's going to be a whole like slew of amazing backyard poems. I think I've gone through the same thing where people are so grateful to see each other on like a morning walk that they'll wave and say hello. It's really heartening. I actually had kind of a moving moment the other day where I just saw like a husband, a father with probably like a 1.5-year-old, and he was teaching him how to walk in his back driveway area. And I was like, oh my God, life's going to go on. There's a 1.5-year-old, so absolutely adorable, doing his first steps. And that was just from literally like a half an hour walk around my neighborhood. So I think it's something about that would be your world, right? And I do think, like, I think the Rivard Report, our online newspaper here, has a great idea about like snapping your surroundings, like posting photographs of people, of things you're seeing just around you in your surroundings. So there's something good about being having to slow down a little bit, a little less motion, even if you have a busy day. We are probably absorbing our surroundings a little bit differently because we're in them longer, and we can't escape them as easily. Like my husband was going to do, one of our trees in our backyard was blooming. It's spring, everybody. It's still happening, right? And he was going to do kind of like a slow-mo daily shot of the tree blooming more and more. I don't think he would have ever thought of that if we weren't stuck at home watching our tree a lot.
Oh my God.
You know what I mean?
We have an ailanthus that just bloomed after 2 years.
Yeah.
And it has 2 huge red flowers. It's on our kitchen windowsill. And we have all been so obsessed with this flower and how beautiful it is and how amazing. And it didn't bloom and we thought it was dying. And then it just shot up all of a sudden this spring. Things like that mean a lot. On the other side, which I think is interesting, and then I think we're almost out of time. We went through a whole hour, Alexandra.
Yeah, there's a lot more that could be talked about, I'm sure. But yeah, this has been fun.
That, you know, if people have questions, we can answer them through comments. We're happy to. I think that Alexandra is modest, but I think she has developed really beautiful and substantial curriculums for the teaching of poetry online. I was really very impressed and a little intimidated in a good way. It was like, I thought, wow. But one of the things I would just sort of maybe say in conclusion, and love to hear your thoughts on this, is our relationship to our virtual space has been really changed, I think, by this experience. And it's maybe changed how we see our ability to deliver education a little bit through the virtual space. And I'm trying to think why. I mean, it could just be me because it's the first time I've really done it. But I feel that I suppose it's a little bit of a poetic idea, but online education always offered access and made it easier for people to participate, which was good. But it never was seen as offering community or intimacy, particularly. And I think that because we've experienced its potential to kind of provide some of that in a new way, I think it might change how we view online education.
Sure, I think it's going to be much more fleshed out than it was before. You have all these teachers that are having to pivot and teach online and never had to before. It's going to be much more a thing we can pull out of our back pocket.
Exactly.
We're going to have all this online curricula that we never had before. We might see more of it as a friendly companion to online teaching than more than even before, because obviously people had Blackboard and other platforms before COVID-19, but it's going to be, I almost see it running parallel with online teaching, never to replace online teaching. There's nothing like person-to-person contact. We're going to be so happy to see each other in the live classroom after this, but so much will have been developed that I think that's a richness that we can take out of an extremely, extremely difficult time that, of course, we wish we were not going through.
Yeah.
I mean, to make seriously a huge understatement of our whole session, but to make lemonade out of lemons, I mean, there is going to be new rapports that will have happened, new ideas like this Texas-wide reading series where different writers from Texas can just be featured so easily every month because we don't have to pay for that visiting author coming to speak. Don't get me wrong, I'm going to do as many visiting author gigs as I can when we finally can. But that's just a nice other way to have people meet writers, to hear their voice, to have them parachute into a classroom space. I think we're going to be much more happy to do that, have the tools to do it, and it will probably just happen more fluidly and easily than ever before.
We probably always could have done it, but we weren't quite confident of the experience, I think.
Right.
We are now.
Nothing like having to learn because of necessity, right?
Exactly. And I think before I'd always thought, well, why would I, ever be so interested in that screen? And now I know, I mean, I've been, like seeing you today, it's like a big treat, I mean, it's an interview.
As it is for me to see you, Sheila.
It's like, wow, Alexandra, yay.
And people feel with you. It's like a new window in your home that you're looking out of much more than before. And you do feel, I'm sure there'll be discussions about like, how do you feel with people on Zoom or some video conferencing tool like we're using StreamYard versus in person? What are the difference? I can see huge sociological studies out of that. But I do feel like
in some ways it's an equalizer, and in other ways it does distance you. But I do feel that I love, I guess I'll just close with that idea of the archive. That is so interesting, that one of the things you were talking about is this idea that I think we're getting to a place where we understand much more clearly than perhaps we have ever allowed ourselves to understand how much all art is a collective activity. I mean, do you know what I mean? I mean, you are an individual artist, of course, and you have your own genius or voice or this or that. But I feel like the age of the great, like, I thought it was a very macho thing, but that great American novelist who was this genius up on a thing, who really didn't have to deal with other people. We're really seeing more and more that all of these processes happen through exchanges with other people. You know, I don't know if you remember at Gemini Inc. when we brought that Douglas Brewster from University of Austin, and he was Shakespeare's handwriting specialist. He was
Sure.
and one of the things he realized was they were all writing on each other's plays all the time, which makes sense. You know, it wasn't just, oh, William Shakespeare's in his little, you know, whatever they called the men parlor room. I think he lived in one room in London or whatever, writing these amazing plays all by himself. No, he's going out and, you know, talking to other people about what he's writing or getting reactions, has his little group, which makes sense because we are so inherently a social creature. But I think that that idea of this class archive, I thought was one thing I didn't know. And that's super interesting.
And I do think, just to pipe in for a moment, I do think collaborations are happening more easily, and that's really, really exciting. And that collective energy is really amazing right now in the arts. Like, people are doing Facebook groups and posting things. Artists are selling their art. Like, there's a San Antonio artist Facebook group just for that. And, you know, selling or just telling people about things. So new communities are happening that would not have happened otherwise because of these online options. I've also noticed that people are kind of sharing quiet together in different ways. Like, I saw one option for a workshop, which I really thought was lovely, where you just sign in for an hour. Maybe it's lunchtime, maybe it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Someone gives you a few prompts in the beginning, and then you just write quietly, and you have everyone's face kind of up there, but you're just writing, and maybe you share at the end or you don't, but it's almost like it's a sharing a quiet, generative space together without having to have a lesson or things or that. I thought that was lovely. People are really trying to nurture each other now because we're scared. It's a highly unusual time. You know, the news has, you know, alarming statistics every day. How do you balance that with something that can keep you centered and keep you creative and keep you hopeful? So sometimes it's allowing for these communal spaces of quiet that allow people to feel supported. So I think, and there'll be many more ideas coming out after today, Sheila. You know what I mean?
Oh, it's so great.
Yeah, and the collaboration and collective idea, I think, is a really, I feel like there's been a lot of warmth coming out of this time that's emitted itself via virtual interfaces.
I agree.
And that's been very heartening, you know.
And I think that you've given everybody a lot of wonderful ideas to mull over. I love that. I didn't know about that quiet workshop. That's a lovely idea. But also, you know, it's just been super fun to talk to you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Yeah, it was just great to spend a Saturday with you, Sheila. I loved it. And thank you for asking me on. I really appreciate that.
We're really lucky to have you. I just want to repeat for everyone in the audience out there, you can ask questions and we will answer them, right, Alexandra? We'll go on and type away. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thanks, AWP. Bye, Sheila. It was great. Bye.